webinar that we're putting on. Recordings in progress, which is fantastic. So today's focus is writing the proposal. So yesterday we focused on the all the prep work that is involved, or a lot of the prep work that is involved. And today we're going to talk about the actual sections that you're going to need to write about, and offer any tips and tricks and things that have worked well for us. So for today's session, it's the same three speakers as yesterday. I'm going to introduce myself, and I'll let Sheena and Sue introduce themselves. My name is Joe Dragomon. I'm the director of the Biofrontiers Institute's Advanced Light Microscopy Core here at the University of Colorado. And I have had a grand total of 0 successful NIH S10 applications, but I'm getting closer. I got a positive sounding email yesterday, so I'm in a good mood today, which is fantastic. And we'll see what happens. Maybe next year when I do this, I might say 1, which would be awesome. So we'll see what happens. Sheena?
Joe, that is great. I'm Sheena Mache from NYU Langone, the Grossman School of Medicine. Collectively, the DART cores, and I forgot yesterday to mention what DART meant. Thank you, Joe. The Division of Advanced Research Technologies, we have our course centralized. And so we do a collective writing. So we've had 10 successful NIH grants that have, S10 grants that have been written by the core directors.
I'm Sue Weintraub. I'm a professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Structural Biology, University of Texas Health Science Center, San Antonio. I direct the mass spectrometry core. I've been very fortunate to have 9 NIH S10 awards, 1 in the first year of the program, which was 1982, and the most recent one last year in the 40th year. So it's been a great ride with S10. And I did not come up with that name that Joe put after my number of awards.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been a fun process putting all this together. Yesterday was very exciting, and we're confident that today will be equally as informative as it was yesterday for us. Just to go over the structure for the day, just as a reminder. So we are in day 2, we're writing the proposal. As Ken mentioned, the slides and the recording from yesterday's session will be up on the website soon, at some point shortly after this presentation today. Questions are welcome at any time. Please feel free and put them into the chat. We'll get to them as quickly as we can. If there's something that you want to wait for or have more discussion about, there will be time for Q&A at the end, and we'll answer any questions that we can. And other people chime in if you have a good answer as well. And if you want to hear more, at the upcoming ABREF 2023 meeting in Boston, there's going to be a dedicated session for the shared instrumentation grant opportunities. This will be specifically on May 8th, so it's a good day to come. You're going to see and hear from representatives from the NIH, the NSF, and the Massachusetts Life Sciences Center. It's going to be a very informative opportunity for us to learn more. And as the organizer of, or the co-organizer, if you will, of the 2024 meeting in Minneapolis-St. Paul, we will also have dedicated sessions on this. So lots of opportunities for us to learn and make our applications stronger. Hopefully make it harder for the government to say no to us, which would be, I guess, a fantastic opportunity. So today, what we are going to do is just sort of keep the process moving forward. And the first thing we're actually going to focus on today is the scoring process. And I'm going to let Sue, who's been through this a bunch of times and knows what she's talking about, to guide us for the next few slides. Sue?
All right. Thank you. Yes, in addition to submitting a number of proposals, I have had the pleasure of participating in and chaired quite a few of the panels. And while the scoring does not impact what you're going to be doing for writing, I'd like you to have an idea of what is going to happen. We'll talk about the review panel part later, but there will be 3 people who will be assigned to specifically look at your application. They'll probably have at least 8 or 10 total assigned. They're usually experts in your technology, or at least very familiar with it, and certainly familiar with biomedical research, but it's not an absolute. So you don't make any assumptions about what the reviewer will understand about complex technology. This is particularly true if you're asking for something very unique. Now, those of you who weren't here yesterday, and I want to emphasize, is that the requested instrument needs to be commercially available. Anyone can purchase it, has to have a model number, and it has to have some amount of warranty, which is documentation that it's not experimental. But if you've got something that's a really unique model, be sure you explain the capabilities of that instrument, because one or more of the assigned reviewers just may not know about that technology. Now, something that needs to be clear is there are 5 scoreable categories, and they're listed here. The assigned reviewers will give a preliminary score after they've generated their preliminary critique, with 1 being the best and 10 the worst. 1 meaning that there are no weaknesses at all that they see. 2, maybe very little or almost none, and going up the road. Now, there are some reviewers who just never give 1. That's just their rule. But in general, it is based on the weaknesses that are seen and the enthusiasm that the reviewer has based on what you've written. It's really important to you to have all the information, because the review is supposed to be on the words in the proposal, not what the reviewer imagines the applicant is meaning. And we'll go over these different sections here. But what's important to know is that these assigned reviewers will also provide an overall impact score that's a measure of their enthusiasm for the proposal. It's not an average of the 5, but it has to be representative. So for example, if you have 2s and 3s, a reviewer can't then give an overall impact score of 5, and vice versa. So you can't give an overall of 2 and you've got mostly 4s and 5s. Now, it's important to also note that these are preliminary scores, and after the presentations and discussion during the review panel, they can be completely changed, so that the one reviewer who may have more enthusiasm for your proposal has been able to show why it's really strong. The other reviewers may change their score. Now, shown on the next slide, it's also important to understand that many times the numbers of proposals are far more than can be discussed in a regular review panel. And so they're divided based on these preliminary overall scores of the assigned reviewers. And the ones that are considered to have the highest scientific and technical merit, and that's usually in the top half, and I emphasize here, it's the lower numerical scores. You've got to remember that the low scores are better. Only those are discussed and assigned final overall impact scores. The other ones are not discussed. The applicants will still get the written critiques of the assigned reviewers, but they will not get a score, and those cannot be considered for any funding. Anything that has gotten a score is at least in a category that could be. And as I had mentioned yesterday on a review panel, it's absolute. We don't use that word funding. We're always talking about the scientific merit and impact, because as you'll see here on the slide, S10 proposals scores are not percentiled, and different panels have different ranges of scoring. And so it really is how your score is relative within your own instrument and your own panel, but there's no percentiling. Okay, on the next slide, I wanted to mention before I get into justification of need that there's 2 sections that we don't have listed on the slides. The first is an abstract, and this is similar to an abstract that you might prepare for a manuscript, and it's an overall summary. You want to start with where you are. What's the institution? If it's a core, what's the instrument? A very brief mention of the types of analyses and the types of research that will be supported. Many of the assigned reviewers will read the whole proposal, but the rest of the panel, as it's being presented, may go and read the abstract, or they may read it ahead. So it's definitely a very important part of the proposal. Also not listed here is a section called equipment. And this is very different from justification of need. This is where you just list what are the items being requested. You can have that in a list, in a table, cost, and a description of what that piece does. Not the whole technical description, but absolutely no justification here. It's just a list. Totally critical is you have to have a current quote from the vendor for this item. In the guidelines, it says if you don't have a quote, the application won't even be reviewed. Well, I've seen applications reviewed without a quote, but the reviewers are not very favorable about that. And you don't want to have them not be enthusiastic just for something silly that you left off. So be sure that's right on your checklist, but make sure it is current for the time of submission. And we note here the document format, Arial 11, half-inch margins. You'll have forms and other parts that you'll get from your sponsored program office. These days, I don't know if anyone is going to send the proposal back if you've used Arial 12 instead of Arial 11 or so, but please follow the guidelines from the outset. That's important. Okay,
and just before you finish on equipment, an equipment comparison table is really a very nice.
And that's going to be a justification of need.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry. I jumped ahead to the format without talking about the justification. But thank you, Sheena.
Yeah.
Yes. So we talked about this a little bit yesterday. This is setting the stage for the whole proposal. And at the beginning of this section, I like to put a little description of the core and just a little of its history in. And if it's not a core, it's fine. And you'll hear about that more later. But if it is a core, important to list what other equipment do you have, even if it's not the same kinds of technologies. What does this core do and how long has it been around? But then figuring out what you need and why is what we emphasized yesterday, is if you can't come up with a good why now, then maybe you better keep thinking about it and apply next year, because it needs to be impactful on the research of the user group, not if I buy it, they'll come, because it needs to be something that they can really use. Now, it doesn't have to have been proposed in their previous grant applications, but it has to make a clear impact. And you've got to be able to explain why in general terms. Are there any other instruments or technologies that can meet the needs of the users and are accessible? And this, again, we'll cover several times. What is accessible? If it's an instrument in a PI's lab that's only used for the research and it's not shared, that's perfectly fine. But as you'll see in the support letters, you need to get documentation. And we'll go over this again. But this is where a table, let me go. And so why this instrument instead of a lower cost or other commercially available options. And this is where a table, but a clear description can be important. If there are other vendors who make similar instruments, that needs to be clearly stated. If the vendor that you're going for has different cost models, why are you picking this specific one? Because this is not a case where the panel will say, well, I like the proposal, but they've really asked for the too high of a model, and I just think we'll cut the budget and give them something a little less. No, this proposal is evaluated based on what you're asking for and compared with other commercially available options. Now, it's perfectly fine if you're asking for a type of equipment that other vendors make similar models, but you have clear reasons why you're going with this vendor. You can say that if the proposal is funded, you will evaluate at that time other equivalent models to see if if a different one meets the needs. So that's fine, but you've got to really explain why you're picking the specific one you're asking for. And you want to make it in your terms, not just copy out the marketing wording that the company has and list some really arcane detection limits that aren't pertaining to your your own core and your users. And we can answer more about this at later times. So this justification sets the stage for why you need it, and it's got to be convincing. This is particularly a section you may want to have some friends read after you've put it together and say, are you convinced that we need a new piece of equipment? Okay, next slide.
So, but before moving on, I wanted to, talk, since again, I just applied last year. One of the tables that I put together wasn't my idea. I got it from Natalie Sirkova at CU Anschutz, but I loved the idea. Since I was replacing an instrument for basically a like-for-like model, so an old model that was end of life and we need a new one. One of the things I did was noted, I sort of put a line in the sand, I think it was like 2018, all the publications from the major and minor users that had come from the instrument until that date, and then how many more publications since that date, just to show that the instrument remains impactful and further justifies why we need to make sure it's still alive, right? If it's no longer, if the instrument is 10 years old, the question may be like, well, are you even using it anymore? Really? And you want to prove to them that, yes, we are using it. We're using it well, and we're going to keep using whatever it is you allow us to buy, right? And again, it just shows continuity of your thought process, and demonstrates that if the government's going to spend money on your instrument, it's going to be a very impactful use of dollars. So,
I was going to say something that I had said yesterday, and it's worth reiterating. You could be replacing. We listed the three categories. The instrument you have may now be not operational, or you may not be able to get parts. And those are things that you have to justify and explain. And sometimes you may even need to get a letter from the vendor saying parts are no longer available. We won't write a service contract, whatever is the reason. But in here, it's also essential to list all of the other accessible instruments at your institution and any place that are reasonably nearby. There could be lots of reasons why, and this will be covered again in the support letters, but there could be lots of reasons why you can't use somebody else's instrument. But even, for example, if there's biohazard issues where your samples need a certain level of safety and the other ones do not. But you have to really explain, if you're at an institution where there are many, many of your type of instrument, but let's say this is a new user group or a program project group, they can't be using the other ones, and this all has to be explained. Okay, next slide. Technical expertise. As I said, I tend to put the description of the core facility per se in the beginning of the justification more as an introduction, but you do want to say what is available in the core, and in at least one or more places, you will clearly list what equipment you have. Again, I put that in the justification, but the qualification and experience of the facility director and staff. This is really important, both in their technical knowledge and their ability to handle shared samples. You'll also want to explain if sample preparation is needed, if that's something that's done in your lab or in the core, who has the qualifications to do that. All right, what if it's not going into a core? Again, why not? Who has the qualifications to oversee use, maintenance, any upgrades, repairs, minor repairs? That has to be very clear. Day-to-day operation and management. Many cores have an online system that, and this will also be covered mainly in the administration section, but who is responsible for what happens day to day? And also critically important is, if it's a core where the individual users can operate the equipment, who's going to train them? Who's going to be responsible to ensure proper use and safety, both of the user and of the instrument? And then also, who has the expertise for data processing and management? In S10 proposals, there is no requirement for the new NIH section on data sharing and management, the specific section that's new. but you have to explain, and that will be an administration of how the data will specifically be managed. But here's where you put, if you've got some really specialized software or handling, who is the person who's going to do that? This is usually a relatively short section because the key personnel, the facility director and staff, will have their bio sketches included. So a lot of those details will be available, but it needs to be clear their qualifications, how long they've been doing it, and what specialized expertise they might have. Next slide, please.
And so just before going on to the next slide, what I found as last year when I was writing mine, and maybe this is a negative thing, but I felt largely at times I was sort of repeating myself and slightly giving more information in different areas versus others, but there was some sort of repetition in some of the writing, which may lead to inefficiencies on my part. But I don't necessarily think it's bad to remind the reviewer that, you know, you've already talked about this in a previous section, and you can just list out what section it's in, and you can point them back to it in case they're looking for it. You want to make it as painfully clear as possible where all this information is. And I agree with Sue, you know, really listing out all of your years of experience of managing similar types of technologies is instrumental. One of the other things I was warned about very early on was you don't want to have, say, things like, oh, we'll have grad students train other grad students on the instrumentation. That's a big no-no, and so don't do that as far as I know.
Now, it's fine for graduate students to be trained. They just, and even in postdocs, it needs to be clear what the succession plan is if a postdoc is going to be responsible for quite a bit of this. And hey, one thought flew out of my mind right now on this topic, so I'll have to think about it and bring it back later.
Yeah, but showing dedicated staff is a big strength.
Oh, I do remember now. All right, it is not necessary that the PI be someone who has a huge number of publications, because depending on the technology, you may not have the kind of input into the project to merit being a co-author, but it's hoped that the use of the core has been acknowledged. In S10s, it's an absolute requirement that users are supposed to acknowledge the core. But if you can go demonstrate, look at all these publications where they have used the core, that is also a big strength.
Right, and for those of you who are investigators looking to put something in your own lab, to be a little selfish, I'm hoping you can put it into a core instead. It will make your life a lot easier, and it'll make your core facility people incredibly happy to get a new instrument.
Well, it is certainly, I can say from chairing numerous review panels that the longer discussions about where an instrument is located are when it's in an investigator's lab. And the most contentious discussion comes up of whether there really is equitable access or not. So there could well be reasons, there could be a proper location for that instrument in the investigator's lab, but it's got to be really clear how all the users can access it fairly and not just at the whim of the PI. So.
And let me just say that, you know, in a review of a proposal that was submitted a couple of years ago, the question did come back. You know, it was not funded, but the question was, why wasn't this instrument in one of the NYU cores? And so, of course, with resubmission and rethinking about everything, we were able to reconsider with that investigator why it was so important to be in the core. So.
Yeah. Now, there's certainly can be valid reasons. Sample prep may be in a centralized location among a few investigators, and the samples need to be really close to where the instrument is. So again, you've got to be convincing, and the reviewers have to be able to see in the proposal what's the answer, not imagine, well, yeah, that could work out okay. So this is where you use the pages to the maximum to be sure all of the necessary information is there. All right, next slide. All right, research projects. Now this one is equally critical. And I will say it's styled differently in many different proposals. There is one absolute no. Do not use the specific aims page of the major and minor users. This is, if you want to kill your proposal from the outset, that's the easy way to do it. Now, for me and many of the successful proposals, I rewrite the whole section. I do often request the specific aims page from the major user, and then I have a list of the information that I need from them. And this is why you've got to start really early on this part, because sometimes it's hard to get responses. What I feel is really important is have whatever format you pick for these research project descriptions, have it the same for all of the projects. You'll start with the investigator's name, you'll have their affiliation, department, and then list their major funding. You'll put focusing on NIH. If it's one of these really heavily funded investigators, don't put all of the minor ones there, but put the key NIH. You'll put the title, the years, dollar amounts aren't particularly needed. But then you also have to have an indication right here of the percent usage and AUT, accessible user time percentage, that we'll cover next. But then I like to use kind of a formula where the first paragraph describes briefly what the overall research is in this investigator's lab. Now, important to remember, these are funded projects. The review panel is not allowed to comment on whether they think this is the qualities of the research project per se. They can, because they have already been reviewed. And so they can't talk about whether it's a good or bad project, but this is your opportunity to excite the reviewers of why this is something important to study as a whole. And then in the next section or paragraph, I put how this user has used the instruments or the core in the past. Now, obviously, there can be some new users who haven't used the core or have used the technology elsewhere. But if you have some really wonderful preliminary data, this is a place that you can show it. But then the most important part is next, is what will the new instrument do for this investigator? How will it impact and advance their NIH-funded research? As I had said before, it is not likely to be in their proposal already because you haven't had that equipment. Now, if it's a matter of capacity or an old instrument, then that you're replacing, here you could say this instrument has been critical for our work, and if we don't have access to it, it's going to really cause us a problem. Capacity, if we've got to wait 2 or 3 months and it's holding back our research, that also has to be said. And then anything that's in a new accessory or capability of how this is going to move the project forward. This is where you want to mention if there's some accessory, particularly why this investigator needs it. What you absolutely don't want to do is have a following and ending line and say, therefore I need this requested XYZ mass spectrometer for my project. Make sure it's clear what it is that it's going to do. And you could have at the bottom a little summary where it said kind of experiment and the amount of samples. A lot of times you can put a measure of how many samples or how many hours are being used. Now, I often like to group the research projects if there are several different types of experiments. For example, in my most recent one, we did global proteomics, but also cross-linking mass spectrometry. And you can have a summary at the beginning, because anything that is common to all of the projects, you don't want to repeat in each one. So you could explain what the experiment or technology is and how it will be used in general. This is where you'll also put whether it will be self-use by investigators and staff, and there they should say who it is that's going to be using it, or if it's going to be run by the Corps and who's going to be preparing the samples. So you could have that in a summary. You don't want to repeat any more than you have to. You see here it says 4 pages max for each major user. I can tell you that in most reviews, the users aren't even listed by name. They'll often say research is covering cancer, aging, diabetes, and whatever, infectious disease. May or may not highlight an individual investigator. You want to make it really easy for the reviewer to see what they're doing, why, and how, what the impact will be. And if you have 4 pages for each one, that's a whole lot to go through. So make sure that you use this space wisely. Minor users, it's important to show that there are people who, you don't have to have minor users, I'll say that, if you have enough major users. And we're not going to go into the percentages of NIH use. It's a complicated system where you need 3 major users and 35%, et cetera, but we'll be happy to discuss that later if you need. And then minor users, they should each be listed with their name, affiliation, and funding, and a very brief description of what they're going to be doing. So this is a key section that will be much longer than will ever be mentioned in the actual review itself and the critiques. But it will be scored because how impactful is this requested instrument on the review, on the research projects of these users. Okay.
Sue,
yes.
Could I just mention something about,
Sure.
Back to when you have demoed the instrument, that these major users should be, they'll be obtaining the preliminary data. And so this is also very important in terms of this
Yes.
research projects and justification.
Yes, and in the justification, I did not discuss demos. It is really important to be able to show that if you have demo data generated for you, it can be at the vendor, it can be at another institution who has the same type of instrument, but it should be on a sample that's either from one of your users or representative of the users. It's always nice if you could get the users to provide the data for you, because the samples for you, because then there's no question. But while I will say that I've seen proposals be successful without demo data, you really enhance your chances by making it clear of how that instrument can meet the needs of the users.
So yeah, so from my experience, my most recent, this is where I got hammered the most. I did not do a good job demonstrating within the research summaries how the technology was really necessary and beneficial. So yeah, so this is the easiest one to miss points on, I think. I think everything else is much more straightforward, but really tying it back into the projects I find challenging for myself.
For example, in the mass spectrometry area, there could be, for global proteomics, if the instrument provides identification of a larger number of proteins, or if the detection limits are much lower, or if the accuracy is much better. And that's fine. You could say it's going to do all these things, but why will that benefit the applicant? So what if you can identify another 1,000 proteins? What's that going to do for their project? So you really need to think this, and it needs to be project by project, or at least by groups.
Right, and we're spending a lot of time on this section, but I honestly think it, as a applicant, is definitely one of the hardest sections to write. One of the things I was advised that helped So what I did is I worked with one major user to really flesh out how I wanted their section to look. And then when I got invited others to be major users, I handed them this section and I'm like, try to copy this. And a couple of them did, most of them didn't. But then I was at least able to reformat everything to make it fit at least better than it probably would have. And that's something else here. You're going to probably have to rewrite a lot of this section for the faculty member. You want them to give it to you, but they're going to be all over the map. They're going to do, well, this is how I got funded. And you're like, great, but it doesn't flow with everything else. So it does take a lot of time. A lot of at this point, when you get towards the writing section, it's a lot of herding cats. Like, come on, kitty, kitty, kitty. We're trying to get you something that'll help you. And they'll eventually follow up. But you really have to be persistent in getting this stuff there. So take your time with it. Start early with it as well as you can. If you're in an instrument like mine that's easy to demo, preliminary data truly helps out here. One of the things I did for all the demos is I took a very standard slide. It's actually an Argolite slide, which is common in the microscopy world. And I looked at the same thing on every single one. So I could actually compare across technologies, like is it actually comparable? And that gave a little bit more quantitative data as to why I'm pursuing one thing versus another. So realistic data is important, but uniform data sets of comparison are equally as impactful, if that's even possible in your field.
I mean, I usually have only done one set of preliminary experiments at the vendor, and you don't necessarily have to send it to multiple vendors if you have a reason. But what I say is we do want to move forward, and I will be happy for anyone to contact me. We can meet via Zoom and talk about some of these points. And because each of you are going to have different types of users and different situations. And the key though is to make the information easy to find by the reviewers, because the easier they can find it, the more they're convinced, the more enthusiasm you're going to have, and the lower numerically your score will be. Okay, next slide.
So before we move on, there was one more question, and this is actually quite relevant in my opinion. It was a bit higher up. Sorry if I paraphrase this incorrectly. So the question was, do you have to actually identify and give descriptions for major and minor users, or can you just do groupings of the major users? I'm just imagining.
No. Okay, no. Right. Each user has to be listed individually. I have seen a proposal fare very poorly where they just said, these are all the major users, and this is why they need the instrument. So each project needs to be described. The grant has to be listed. The overall research of the investigator has to be presented, and then why that investigator will be impacted. Now, it is true, and I'm going to look here in the guidelines from NIH, and it says, in cases of certain technologies, such as computer systems or X-ray detectors, a large number of users exceeding what's necessary to make a strong case for the need of the instrument can be expected. So keep in mind, the sole number of users isn't compelling. And in that case, if you have users who individually needed only a relatively short percentage, highlight the most interesting ones and say this is representative of the other 50 users who are already committed, and you'll list the others in there, but you don't need to describe every project if it's something that is a very large number of users for each one individually, relatively small proportion of time.
So would there be any difference in this section for the high-end instrumentation?
No.
It's something I have no experience with.
No, the actual formatting between all three proposals is the same. All of the sections are the same, and the information, it's just the dollar value. And then the big ones, BIG, were because that institution hasn't been funded for the period listed over 250,000. But no, everything else is the same, because the cost of the instrument is not a driving factor here. It's the justification for the specific instrument and how it will meet the needs of the investigators. Okay, next slide. All right, summary tables, and we can talk a little bit here about AUT. This is something that is the most confusing and something I wish they would come up with a different way of doing it. I'm going to read something that I have here from the guidelines because it says the AUT, that's accessible user time, is the number of annual hours the instrument can be practically used. Now they say for biomedical research. And it can be limited by the times the instrument operator is available. If you've got to have an operator, you can't expect to be providing somebody 24/7. There could be all kinds of scheduling, holidays, whatever, that can be included. And what that means is your accessible user time is reduced by the times that no one is there or the building can't be accessed for whatever reason. Instruments that could be used 24/7, a mass spectrometer with an autosampler, but you've got to spend time for calibration, you've got QA, QC. You just have to explain what it is. That's the first key point. The review panel may think, well, that's overestimate or underestimate, but as long as you've got a clear explanation, that's the most important part. Now, as I had said yesterday, I often first start with my user group and just put it in mind by percentage of use. I don't try and mess with the hours until the end. And then you attribute however long that they will be using the instrument. It's much easier when it's self-use by investigator personnel, because then you can say, I expect to run the scope. I don't know, I've never used one, but X number of hours in a day. And for example, there may be days if someone has used it that it's not realistic for 2 users or 3 in a day. So it's all very particular for your instrument. But the first key point is just to explain how you come up with the number. In the end, it needs to be in hours, but you're going to have a table that's going to list the investigators. I often include this in the same table excuse me, with their research funding, because, and this is spelled out specifically in the FOA and where it'll tell you what needs to be there, but the investigator's name, their grant funding, and then I just put a column on that, in that table with their AUT. And I always list the AUT in hours and percentage because it has to be hours, but it's a lot easier to think of in terms of percent. And then the feature or accessory, these are specific items that are budget items. Now, if you have an instrument with many different special characteristics that are not listed by budget, but someone needs, for example, in mass spectrometry, you might need multiple stages of tandem MS. It doesn't hurt to include that. If all the investigators need all the features and all the accessories, you don't need to list them and just say 100%, 100%. But the key here is if you have, let's say, 15 major users and only one needs an expensive accessory, there is the possibility that that accessory line will be cut out of the budget. That does not impact your score. Budget has nothing to do with score. But after all of the reviewing is done and the scoring, then the review panel has a chance to say whether that accessory is approved or not. So that's why it's important to make it clear how many people need an accessory. I will say that if, for example, your instrument is above the cost of a one of the categories, let's say you're in the regular S10 and your instrument costs $650,000 because you've added on a specialized unit. Well, you can then say the institution will pay the $50,000, and so it's less important to justify accessories. But this is two tables that need to be there. And as I said, the user table by accessory, if everyone uses all the accessories, it doesn't need to have a separate table with 100%. I think that's all on this topic. Next.
So AUT honestly is the hardest thing to wrap your head around. And I also find it, for my couple of tries, the biggest black box or unknown that you're going to come across for your reviewers. Some may love your logic and some may hate your logic, depending on the panel. And it's something that I have no good answers to. The best I've been able to, after talking about it for several years with people, is you want to just a very logical determination of what your AUT is. You want a good sound logic to it and how it accurately reflects what your users are going to be doing.
I remember the AUT, you're starting with some base number. You can calculate if it's an instrument that can operate 24/7, there's X number of hours in a year. You realistically can take off a few weeks for vacation. You can't say it has to be operating during vacation time. And then you've got to plan for maintenance. So be realistic. How much time for maintenance? How much time for QA, QC? You've got to leave some time for new users, and you can leave a little bit of time for method development. But you also, in the first year, of course, you're going to have some amount of time for learning and education. But the most important thing is to be clear how you came up with the number and make it clear that the instrument is going to be used for a large percentage of the time. You don't want something that's so specialized, it's going to be used once a week for a couple hours. That's just not going to make it. But if it takes a whole day to prepare an instrument for a very specialized experiment, that reduces the available time, and you just make that clear.
Yeah, no, you try to make it as clear as you possibly can, and you just do the best with it. I like talking to people not in my field, because if it sounds defensible to them, then I think you got a decent shot. One of the challenges I face, for a core facility that's always open, if you take 75% of the 8,800 hours that are in a year, you're at 6,300 or some huge number of hours. While it's true that it's usable, my users and their PIs are going to be like, this instrument is way too full and we can't actually get on there at a reasonable time. And it very much depends on on your institution when people are actually there. It's just a hard one. So logic is going to be your friend here, and something that sounds defensible.
I can see that there's lots of questions about AUT. What I'm thinking is we really should move forward right now, and then let's talk about this in the Q&A section, and just keeping in mind that this is where you should find someone who has had a successful S10 for your type of instrument, and see what they put and see how you can model. But we know it's an important and difficult problem, and let's cover that more in the Q&A.
So Sue, before we go on to the next slide, I know we talked about this, but I just want to make sure I have the answer correct. We're now no longer limited for major users to be only R01 faculty. It can be any NIH funded faculty members. Is that correct? Right. So R21s, R03s, things
everything. But and you'll see this clearly in the FOA. Per grant, only one user. So if you have co-PIs or multiple PIs, it can only count for one person. And I'd have to look closely into when it's a PO1, because those have to be able to count if you're one of the investigators on a PO1 that is considered separate funding. But no, they used to have very complicated set of what kind of funding was allowed, but it's just one per person.
Yeah,
I mean, multiple grants per person, but
correct.
one person per grant.
Yeah. Yeah. And for the PO ones, and, for instance, some of the other P and U grants, they do consider, at least our experience has been, they consider the multiple PIs.
The project investigators with.
Correct.
Right. Yes. Okay, Sheena, your turn.
Okay. So this is the administration or organization management plan section. So you're limited to 6 pages, but the important thing is to convey the institutional support in terms of is there a great space for this, and so what we do in this section is we describe our centralized organization. If you don't have a centralized organization for cores, then you can describe your department or institutional organization. But the focus is on this proposed instrument and its access to the community. So we also write about the core organization, operation, and financial plan in terms of how this instrument will be managed, plans for utilization and expanding that user base, because they want to make sure, A, that the instrument is going to be accessible, especially to the major users, and then to the minor users and the rest of the community. And also in terms of how will you expand that user base? So for instance, marketing, is it on your website? How are you going to make information about this new instrument available? In terms of access, one of the best ways is using something like an iLab system or, a centralized lab management system where people can get on and either schedule time for a user-based instrument, or they can schedule experimental discussion time for projects. So it's very important to make sure that it is transparent and clear in terms of access, where it will be, how well it will be taken care of. You should also consider the safety and regulatory oversight, particularly for the lab that it's in, and especially if you're doing any safety considerations. Of course, the institutional commitment and support has to come through loud and clear, and that is usually in terms of the dedicated space and infrastructure that's being made available for this particular instrument. So there's a lot of room here for details. Really important to include them in terms of, especially if it's going to be, a very high-end instrument. Sometimes people do include detailed drawings in terms of where the instrument is going to be, or if there were necessary renovations that were going to happen that the institution was going to, of course, take care of, or were there special power considerations or HVAC considerations. In terms of the financial table, so a lot of people ask, well, how do you put together an operating budget to describe what you're going to do for the 5 years of the, service life of the instrument? Of course, most of these instruments have much longer service life. But what the recommendation is to include a year 1 operation costs and then years 2 through 5 operation costs. And so those include line items for instance, your staff salaries in terms of who is going to be responsible for the operation and maintenance of the instrument, service contract costs, supplies, and any associated chargeback revenue. So we tend to put together a very detailed financial table laying out the operation and the costs that are associated with this. Now, of course, this is a budget. And so, of course, we do this based on experience, but also in terms of talking to our vendors, in terms of talking to other, colleagues. So again, going back to what Sue has talked about, think about the reviewer. You don't want the reviewers sitting there and guessing. You want to be as clear and transparent as possible. And then finally, data management plan, although it's not required, include a data management plan in this section. It will demonstrate that you're thinking ahead and you're preparing for the instrument's success.
Excuse me a minute, Sheena.
Sure.
I need to interrupt. A
Sure.
data management plan, the management needs to be described. What you don't need is the separate data management and sharing plan that's in the investigator.
Correct.
Right.
Yep, correct. Thank you for clarifying that.
Because I've actually had criticism on a proposal when I didn't say how long we stored the files for the investigators. So it needs to be very clear where these files are. Are you storing and maintaining for the investigator, or are you giving them to them? Now, we don't have to say it has to be just clear what is being done.
Correct.
Because in the core especially, who owns the data files? This is not something clear. Your institution may have come up with policies and mechanisms for this, but
yes,
thank you.
Ideally, your institution has a data governance plan. But to be, very clear about this, every core, whether you realize it or not, you have a data management plan. How long do you retain the data? How do you share the data? Where is it stored? Where is it archived? How do other people get access to that? So this is what we're talking about in terms of data management. And, it's really important to understand that most of the instruments that people now operate are generating the majority of data on campus. So it's really important to have a cohesive plan for how that data is going to be managed. And it will have a very positive aspect, to this application. So again, it's not required, but I just think that, being a core, our deliverable is data, that we should be including how we manage our data. And, it's all about data access. So I'll leave that section there. And I think on the next slide,
so Sheena, I just wanted to bring up here, again, as advocating for instruments to be put in cores, if you're going to rely on user fees to help pay for service contracts or upkeep or whatnot, I found it useful to demonstrate how much we acquire in a given year from user fees here, especially if it's a similar type of technology or a replacement, because you can sort of propagate that number forward, assuming like very similar levels of usage. We should be collecting about this much money per year to show your financial stability going forward. So it can be useful to interject it here, but you have to have a defensible hourly rate, something that makes sense. And hopefully you have that within your institution. I know not all institutions are as rigorous with that, but you definitely want to show that you're going to maintain it for years 1 through 5. I like to show what I plan on doing for years 6 through 10, even though that's not obligatory. It sort of paints the global picture to say I know what I'm talking about, and is again a good use of funds.
Right. And, again, that's what I was referring to in the financial table, Joe, was in terms of all of that, the associated chargeback revenue in terms of how are you going to charge for this access to the instrument, because, there has to be cost recovery in any regard, right? Unless you are having, the benefit of a very generous institutional investment that will cover all the service contracts, all the supplies, and all the salaries.
But what I need to explain, though, is review panel understands that this budget, unlike the budget for the instrument that has to be specific for the quotes that you receive, this is an estimate. This is saying, are you thinking about how much money it can be bringing in? Nobody's going to say that it has to be exact, because you're predicting. So they understand.
Correct. It's a budget. It's a proposed budget. Okay, and so here we're talking about the institutional commitment. So again, this is critical to the success for the proposal. It has to be clearly documented, and it has to show that your institution is very receptive and very supportive of this new instrument. So, you want to show prior competence and support of the core facility or whoever is going to be managing and responsible for this instrument, in terms of historical trends of instrument use, training, maintenance. And you should also, be able to show that your institution is willing to dedicate and renovate space for the proposed instrument or equipment. Staffing support, service contract, letters from senior administration officials definitely are good, excellent to show support and perpetuity for the instrument. Because again, NIH does not want to give money and then find out that it's not being used. And I can tell you that from personal experience that they are not very happy if they don't see that the instrument is being used. So focus on institutional support and well beyond the award period. Okay, this is a 1-year award. We're accounting for 5 years, but in truth, most instruments are in use longer than that, except for perhaps mass specs. Emphasize training. Emphasize training and outreach. Long-term instrument support means recruiting new users. Okay, so you're going to emphasize that. You're going to be getting the most out of this new instrument, in terms of getting good training so people can use it. If it's a user-based instrument, and if it's not a user-based instrument, it is, having core staff or dedicated staff trained so that they will be experts in terms of operation of this instrument. And as I mentioned before, how do you recruit new users? How do you have existing users learn about the instrument? Are you going to have lecture series, online training, technical support, consultation periods? So all of those things are really important. And of course, here you are going to be preparing that table of previous awards that's going to be included in the institutional letter of support. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah,
okay.
I want to add, there was a question earlier in the chat about does the institution paying for an accessory count as institutional support? No, that counts kind of as goodwill. The institutional support that we're talking about here is maintenance, long-term operation. And so if you have money from the institution, and I believe we mentioned this last time, if there's a choice of where it goes, it's much better to be for service contract and staff salary rather than cost sharing. If there's a way you can manage it within the category of instrument proposal, make it all from the instrument grant and anything else, the instrument for maintenance and operation.
That's a good advice.
Great.
And I'm sure Sheena said it, but these letters have to have dollar numbers. Okay.
Yeah, I think we're getting to that section in a little bit.
Oh, okay. I saw
right after this one. Yeah.
We're getting there.
Oh, okay. All right. I'm jumping ahead.
No, that's all right. So overall benefit, this can be quite brief. You don't necessarily have to fill all through 3 pages, even though I largely did. I use the overall benefit section as more of an exercise for myself, just basically rewalking the reviewer from beginning to end about everything that's here, justification, I know what I'm doing, the researchers need all the various components, blah, blah, blah. And I actually referred back to all the sections in it, and it helped me make sure that I had everything I needed earlier on. Now, the other 2 on here will say, like, don't do that. That's way too long. The reviewers don't want to read it. I think you have to do what's most comfortable for you, but do remember, we will talk about this in another slide or two. It is a very long document. So think of the reviewers and how many words they're going to be reading, print it out and look at the Arial size 11 font with 1/2-inch margins and just this wall of words at you. It is painful. So keep that in mind. And
I will say that
Stu's going to say something now.
No, in a review panel meeting, I have not heard any comments about the overall benefit section. It needs to be there. It needs to make sense. But if you got plenty of spare time, sure. But put your effort into the other sections ahead of this one.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So these are letters of support that and Sue, your name is on the slide, but.
Oh, yes. Okay, that's fine. I'm happy to talk about it because I've had to struggle with this many times because administrators understandably don't want to commit ahead for dollars. But it has to be really clear. Now, if you are in an existing core that has historically had support from the institution and the letter can say, this is what we have provided in previous years, and we are willing and prepared to continue the same way. They don't have to commit to the exact number of dollars, but it has to be absolutely clear that they know that this isn't just, well, whatever you need, maybe we'll think about it. And it can be very hard to get this from your administration. This is one of those planning sections that Joe especially talked about yesterday. If you can't get a strong letter from your institution documenting that support, you might as well forget putting in the proposal, because I've seen some incredibly great proposals where the institution doesn't supply and it's not clear where the rest of the funding is going to come from. Now, another thing that has to be in this letter is the institution saying, if there is a shortfall, let's just say you're a core that easily can bring in enough operating expense to cover most of what, essentially everything you need, just because of the nature of it. The institution has to say, if there's a shortfall, emergency repair, whatever, we will give that money. And I've not seen a letter be successful without having that specifically written. And again, mentioning what the source of funding is and what they're going to do as far as renovations or ahead of time, I consider that goodwill. Now, stating here is reiterating about access, and these are also considered the letters of support, so they don't count in the page limits. But any claim you make, you've got to have documented by someone. If you can't use an instrument, if for whatever reason, I don't tend to get letters from the users saying, yes, I'm going to use your facility. It doesn't hurt to have it, but they've provided their biosketch and their information. And so I don't usually hear reviewers complaining that there's not a support letter from the users. But anything else, there's one letter that here is also helpful to have. If you are saying that the instrument that you currently have is beyond service life and it's not being supported or parts are not available, a letter from the vendor saying that is really very important. Even if it's sort of common knowledge, don't take any chances and make sure you have that documentation.
Yeah, so letters, don't go short on the letters.
Okay, but I was just going to say, this is where you need to include the table. And I think this goes back to a question that Uma and Isabel had. The table that lists the information of the performance of all previous S10 awarded instruments for the past 5 years. Okay, so the table, has 9 columns, and it does include a column in terms of publications. And I will emphasize, this is really, really important. This is something that they are absolutely adamant about in terms of being able to see publications.
Being acknowledged.
And if there are no publications, please provide an example, an explanation, following this table. Because we have been dinged about this. So,
but if it's not your core, and if it's a completely different type of instrument, you really can't take responsibility for whether they were good about that. It's obviously.
But the table is absolutely required. It says it.
Absolutely.
And this comes back to what we talked about yesterday in your preparation. These are part of the checklists. There are all these little be sure to include this in the FOA, and you better include it because they're looking for all those things.
In the letter, it needs to come from the administrative person responsible, vice president programs, director of course, whoever, not the applicant. This is from the administrator.
Yeah, this is something I do, by the way. Okay, so just to make it clear.
Well, yeah, you're the administration.
Yeah, and depending on your institution, you may have someone awesome like a Sheena who can do that for you, or you may be at a separate institution where there isn't an awesome Sheena, and you have to put the table together for those people, right? And so you have to really pay attention to this. And this is where if you know colleagues that are pursuing the same thing, you can put together the same table. So it's very important. Go through that checklist. Make sure you have all the letters backing up everything for you. It makes your life a lot easier.
Programs can certainly tell you what instruments have been purchased. But again, I would like to hope that your administration can help you with that one.
Yeah, be hopeful. Okay. So if you add all the sections together, if you go to the maximum, if you're not a concise writer like me, you're going to get 60 full pages of text. That's a lot of words, a lot of reading. So, clarity and specificity are key. Highlight the different things, make it as painfully as obvious for the reviewer where all the information is. Utilize good formatting, make it clean and easy to find the various sections, things of that nature. If it's hard to find in your proposal, the reviewer probably won't see it and you'll get dinged on it, right? And that's problematic. Yep.
Two things I need to add, thinking back on proposals, but also in guidelines that are sometimes missed. And this has to do with literature citations and references. So it is completely allowable for references pertinent to the project summaries, to the major and minor users. Those references can go in the section with, and they make most sense to be right there. So if the investigator is highlighting their research or how they've used an instrument, their own references can be there. But anything that's in the general section is going to go in a separate reference section. So that's something important, that you can organize it. I like to have the references for the projects with the individual projects, so someone doesn't have to go looking for them.
No, I agree. So it's a lot of text, and just because you have 60 pages of space, you don't have to fill 60 pages of space if you don't need it. So make sure you're being efficient and judicious with your verbiage.
I always have a pseudo table of contents at the beginning. We don't have page numbers anymore, but at least listing the sections by headers and what is under there, because it's exactly what it says here. If something is hidden and the reviewer can miss it, that's a real problem.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we want to take these last 2 slides or 3 slides to talk about what happens when you turn your stuff in, right? Because, again, for new people like myself, we send it off to the black box of the NIH and we don't know what's going to happen. So we don't necessarily, you can read these steps. There's just a lot of steps involved. Basically, it gets assigned to a review group, a review officer. It gets review officer invites reviewers and a chair for an ad hoc panel. It's assigned, evaluated, preliminary scores, and if it's good enough, it gets discussed and then presented, and everyone that's on the panel gets to then give a score that's usually in line with whatever the assigned reviewers.
Let me interrupt.
Please.
The only scores that are said out loud are the assigned reviewers before and after the discussion. The other reviewers each will put their score into the score sheet, and if they're going to vote outside of the range of the assigned reviewers, they have to have at least said something in the discussion of why they have a different opinion or provide something written.
So after that, then you start getting feedback, and the feedback is incredibly useful for newer people. If you're not, you'll get reviewer comments just like for a publication, and these will really base your foundation on if you get to respond in kind and through the various processes or not. If everything keeps going your way, and I really love this term, it gets to a second level of review by the Council of Councils, which really sounds very Lord of the Rings-ish or something of that nature. That's the council that really starts determining the priority for the funding, and then later the funding is actually assigned. So there's this big whole process for your review. There's a whole bunch of steps to it. You may not see some of it. Some of it will always just say pending until the scores actually come out. And you're just sort of waiting for this process. So there's a lot of steps involved, which is also explains why it can take a long time.
And one thing I need to add here, there's two people who often get confused about their roles. The SRO, Scientific Review Officer, manages the review process. The program officer is not involved in that at all. And they are often listening in during the review panel, but they do not make any comments. But afterwards, and after the Council of Councils, the proposals that are then considered for funding are managed by the program officer.
Great.
So completely different people.
Yep. All right. Thanks. And then as for the scores, these are relative ranges in globally what one can expect. These are not absolutes by any stretch of the means. You can get a 10 to 15, and you should definitely be super psyched about that and go out and celebrate. 15 to 20, you're also feeling quite good, and I think that's probably quite universal across the board. 21 to 30 this is where you're starting to get into your borderline ranges. Like you may make it, you may not make it. It really depends on a lot, right? And you get some major weaknesses, perceived weaknesses. You will have to prepare to resubmit because you never know, which means hopefully not redoing 100% everything, but fixing the weaknesses. Also preparing for a just in time, which we'll talk about in the next slide. 31 plus, okay, so that's most likely just a learning experience. Incorporate those reviews and decide whether or not you're going to resubmit. Sue and Sheena, correct me if I'm wrong. You don't have to resubmit the very next year. You have a window for the resubmission. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Great.
Right. And something that I want to bring up, I've interrupted before the last category, but on occasion, there is an actual factual error in a comment by a reviewer, something that's totally wrong. Now, I will have to check on the exact timing, but I believe there is a very short time right after you get the score and the critique where you can contact the program officer or the SRO. I'd have to see who is listed.
It's it's the program officer.
This is absolutely wrong. Now, that's different than later at the just in time, but if there's something that's just completely, like they say, there wasn't a quote in this proposal, and you go back and you say, the quote is right there. It's important to make that clear.
Yeah, it very much so is. I think it's within 2 or 3 weeks of your scores being released to you. So you need to read through it. Your first pass will probably make you very angry. And so take a night off, reread it the next day a bit more calmly, and check for that. and then schedule a meeting with the program officer to discuss the whole thing. And, be respectful. These are people just doing their best. Mistakes happen. Some of it is debatable. And also remember, the reviewer may not be an absolute expert on your technology. Therefore, you can have issues. So it happens more often than you think, and it's your job to be thorough with them, but be fair, and also recognize that they did a good job reviewing you as well. But point out what you consider as a mistake and let the program officer take it.
And I'm seeing in the chat, people are saying things happen to them and the program officer wouldn't do anything about it. Sometimes it's just not feasible for them to do anything right after that review. And this is something that you would unfortunately have to wait until the next submission. But I agree, it's a miserable thing to read the review and see something that's wrong. But the reviewers are human and the chair, and some things slip through. We try to emphasize accuracy and scores matching words and critiques, but it's not always feasible.
And then worst case scenario is a not scored proposal, because you don't really get any feedback, or you get minimal feedback. There I would recommend leaning on your colleagues as much as possible, just to make sure, learn from your mistakes, get your friends to read through it, and try again. And that's about it. So you get these various ranges. These are very ballpark, technology wise, maybe very different. And yes, you can resubmit only one time, but I think you have like a 3-year window to resubmit. Might be 2 years. Double check that from your thing. So otherwise, it becomes a whole new proposal. So,
and you can only submit one resubmission, and
yep.
one only.
Exactly. So the last slide, I don't want to read through this just because it doesn't apply to everybody. But at some point, if things are going well for you, you'll get a just-in-time request, and the just-in-time is a whole bunch of different things at the same time, which is like an updated quote. It's a new response to the reviewers, a whole bunch of different things which you can read here. And it's something I wish they would let you know that may be coming your way, so you can mentally prepare for this, because typically you have 3 weeks to respond to this when the just-in-time comes through. So my advice to you, so I haven't gotten my just-in-time yet, so I'm hoping that it does come. But my advice to you is, when you get the reviewer comments, and if you get one of those borderline scores or even like a good score, start thinking of the reviewer critiques and how you're going to respond to them. Because if you get asked, you want to be ready to do it. And if you think you need to collect more data, create a new table, you don't want to be scrambling in this 3-week period to get that done. So start early, and if you don't get a just-in-time, then you have to resubmit. Well, you're already on your path for resubmission anyway. So it's very useful to start thinking about, and just be aware that this question or this document of information may be asked of you. All right, so it's a lot, which is fantastic.
Yeah, but we didn't leave enough time for our
I know, because it's too long. The whole application is too long. That's the thing. It should be a 5-page application. Please give me money, please. Pretty please.
All right, so what I will tell you again is, with this session that we're going to have at the ABRF conference, is an opportunity to provide input to representatives from the funding agencies on parts of the application, or if you've served as a reviewer, what you would like to see changed and why. And it's a real chance to get your input directly in a group environment.
Yeah, so ABRF is going to be an excellent follow-up resource for this. You can continue the discussion there. I believe we got to almost all the questions in the chat. If we didn't get to your question, please email us and we'll answer to the best that you can. Jody did bring up an interesting thing that definitely happened to me multiple times, which is getting this automated just-in-time request. And I was like, woohoo, I got funded within weeks of submitting. And no, it wasn't it. But just, it comes from the program officer. You can go to the website and click on the just-in-time and nothing will be there. It's a little...
You'll know when it's the real one.
Yeah, you'll know.
But
at least
I do want to comment to Angel or Angel, I'm not sure, apologize, but it is true that there could be something factually wrong in a critique that the reviewer did not change after the discussion, but it may have well been discussed at the review panel, the person corrected, and so the rest of the reviewers heard the right information. So unfortunately, we can't force the review panel to change their critique after the meeting, which they're supposed to do. So
in that instance, she acknowledged that it was missed and they made a mistake. The table was there, but said, don't try arguing this because you're not going to get the other reviewers to significantly change their score. Instead, when you resubmit, just say, we thank the reviewers for their consideration. The table, in fact, was there.
Yes.
But we decided to bold the heading to make it easily accessible. Something a little diplomatic, but kind of saying, hey, this was an honest mistake.
That would definitely be as diplomatic as possible. And I wish we had more time, but again, we're all willing and happy to help you, show you examples of our proposals, and each situation is very different. And but it's a fabulous program, and the NIH people with it are very dedicated and committed to course. And I didn't say enough on yesterday about Marge Tingle and how totally essential she was for this program, driving it through all times of high and low funding, and also committed to shared resources. So we just couldn't have managed without her.
And yes, great, Ken, thank you for answering that in the chat. The slides will be posted, and the recordings, they're all going to be on one of the websites, I believe, but definitely emailed to all of us, or at least links emailed to all of us. Yeah, reach out to us. I reach out to my two more experienced colleagues that are leading this. But if you're younger and newer and trying to figure it out, feel free and toss your questions my way.
Watch this age here.
I didn't say older. I said more experienced. I didn't even say more senior, more established. You know, hey, look, we can go back to the introductory slide. I have 0. You all have officially infinitely more than I have, right? Because
Joe, you should get an award for working with both of us. You've been fabulous.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attendance. We appreciate all of you signing in, and I think this greatly just illustrates where the ABRF needs to get to and keep pursuing these types of things for all of us. So thank you all for your time, and have a good day.
I will put a pitch in for those of you who are not ABRF members, that there is a very large number of benefits of membership besides just the annual conference. So we hope you will consider joining.
Absolutely.